Hi everyone, welcome to this panel discussion about debating careers and resumes and all things fun and in between. We've got a lovely panel joining us today, one who will be just a little bit late, but we'll start in the meantime and they'll join us hopefully very, very soon. Obviously, the nature of this is that all the people on this panel work, so naturally things may come up. I might just hand over to each of them to introduce themselves, and I would ask them, they're all have had some very impressive accomplishments, both in debating and in the start of their careers, so I would encourage them to not be too modest as they tell us about themselves. But I might start with you, Lucy, if that's okay.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Lucy. I'm from Ireland. I did my undergrad a long time ago. It was in politics, history, international relations, and some social justice. So basic arts degree that's not very good for employment. But yeah, I did a lot of debating and still do a lot of debating. I suppose if Jess wants me to talk through achievements, I like 5-time Euros breaking judge and lots of speaking fun times. Never broke as a speaker as an international because I didn't really speak at internationals. But yeah, love debating, CA a lot, still CA a lot, still get forced into speaking a lot. In terms of my career, I started through debating by coaching schools in my local area. That made me kind of fall in love a little bit with coaching, but not teaching. So I realized I didn't want to be a teacher, but did want to be some sort of person who taught teenagers how to do things. So I spent 4.5 years working in language schools and managing language schools, teaching English, which actually found a lot of that also helped me with debating, but also debating helped me with that. Then I moved on to private sales and was a PA for a CEO. That was a lot of relationship management, which again, debating helped with. And now I work in recruitment for the charity sector. So I hopefully will be able to help you with very specific cover writing skills if anybody has any very specific questions. But yeah, so I work, as I said, for an executive search company that specializes in the charity sector. And I manage the communications for that company as well. So the social media, all client facing interaction, and dealing with the general day-to-day of the company as well. So that's me in a nutshell. Hi.
Thank you very much, Lucy. And Josh, over to you next.
Yeah, absolutely. Very nice to meet everybody. So my name is Josh, for those of you who don't know me. I am originally from the US, but I was a military kid, so I grew up bouncing around all over before I ended up in New York for my undergraduate degree. There I studied policy and politics with a focus on China, which is why I ended up shifting over and moving to China after graduation. Once I got there, I ended up working at a communications education startup in Shanghai called LearningLeaders, which has grown over the last couple of years to be a really large private debate coaching and education presence in Asia, and specifically the largest in China. When I was at LearningLeaders, I really enjoyed getting to do both debate coaching, but also working in HR. And after I left LearningLeaders, I'm now pursuing a master's in gender and sexuality at the London School of Economics. And next year, I'll be heading back to Beijing, which I'm really excited about, to be doing a master's in global affairs at Tsinghua University through the Schwarzman Scholars program. So I actually started debating after I left uni. I had a little bit more of an atypical journey. It wasn't until I started working at LearningLeaders that I discovered what this crazy thing called debate was all about. And of course, debate has been an increasing addiction for me over the last couple of years. I can honestly say, and I'm sure that many of the speakers in this call would agree, that debate has had a really profound impact on just a lot of the things that I'm able to do in the way that I'm able to walk through a lot of the situations at work, but also interpersonally. I feel strongly that any type of teaching or coaching is genuinely just a form of public speaking that debating really helps with. I think literally anytime you're presenting something at work, or if you're literally my job, we had to make weekly presentations to the entire company, and feeling comfortable being on stage, feeling comfortable fielding questions from colleagues who don't always agree with the decisions that you're making or the types of things that you're pitching. Debating really helps with that. And I think even acute examples or acute moments, like in the middle of my Schwarzman interview, when you're being interrupted by people who vehemently disagree with you and want to understand whether or not you think China is a threat to U.S. national interests, is not very dissimilar to fielding a POI from a very aggressive speaker who wants to knock you out. And in fact, many of the questions that I was asked during my Schwarzman interview, which I'd be happy to share with people, are entirely the same as debate topics that you've probably fielded in the past. I was asked about thresholds for monopolies. I was asked about One Belt, One Road, things I felt more than comfortable talking about, given that I've debated that many, many times. And so I think that it really helps at macro level with a lot of soft skills. But I also think that debating, there are watershed moments as well that I've been really, really glad for my experiences with debate. None the least to say all the amazing people I've met along the way.
Oh, that's very nice. Thank you, Josh. And Sarah.
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Sarah. I live in Singapore and I'm based in Singapore currently, but I did my undergraduate studies at the London School of Economics in the UK. So I spent like the last 4 or 5 years debating there. I was briefly affiliated to Oxford as well. We don't talk about that. It wasn't a very big part of my life. It wasn't a very big part of my life. Currently, I am working for the Singapore government. So I actually went to study at uni on a Singapore government scholarship, which means that I have to go back to work for the Singapore government for about 6 years in exchange for 4 years of uni education that they sponsored. So I'm currently working at the Ministry of Trade and Industry in Singapore, and specifically I deal with US trade policy. So in terms of trade diplomacy, as well as like the policy, the trade policy positions and stuff that Singapore takes against, like in relation to the US, as well as in relation to Canada. So I'm part of the North American Europe team. Focusing on the North America bit. In terms of debating, I broke at Novi Sad and reached the Open Finals as a speaker, and as a judge, I broke at I broke at Bangkok, I broke at Athens, and I broke at Astana. So quite recent breaks compared to some of the other people on this call, but I genuinely think that like it's quite interesting how much debating has impacted my work and the kind of like topics that I feel comfortable dealing with. So I don't have an economics background, so the fact that I even went into trade policy is entirely accredited to debating. And I'll be really happy to talk more about people who are interested in some of like the more content heavy side of debating as well, because I feel like very satisfied with how much of that goes on into my like regular work and like the things I do at work.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sarah. And perfect timing. I believe Siri is here on the call. Just joined if you want to if you want to say hello and introduce yourself. And we were just everyone was just finishing giving just a bit of an overview about their background.
All right. Can anyone hear me? Cool.
Yes.
First of all, thanks for having me, and especially thanks to you, Jessica, for being up so late. It is visible, but nonetheless, strongly appreciate your commitment. In terms of my background, I did an undergrad at the University of Belgrade in Serbia quite some time ago. So I studied from 2011 to 15. Did a postgrad in the UK from 16 to 17. Worked for a couple of years. So I worked the last 3 years as a management consultant for McKinsey & Company, primarily based in Belgrade, but really working everywhere from Europe to the Middle East, as well as East Asia. And I'm currently in Singapore as well, at a business school in SIAD. And having an enjoyable evening with colleagues here. So in terms of my debating background, first, before I get into that, I will say without any modesty or restriction that debating was the single most important thing I did in my undergrad, and in many ways shaped like what I did afterwards in my career. I'm happy to talk about that later. It fundamentally shaped some of the choices and made I, at least for the latter half of my 20s, my life much better off, and I assume that will be the case going forward. In terms of what I did as a debater, I'm probably on the dinosaur end of this conversation. I won Euros in ESL in 2014 in Zagreb. I won the Euros in Open in 2016 in Warsaw, which made me the third ESL speaker in history to do that, as well as the first since Oxbridge started competing at Euros. And I was the World's Open semi-finalist in Malaysia in 2015, as well as a World's ESL finalist in Shanghai, the legendary Worlds, in 2014. Beyond that, I did quite a bit of judging and CAing, as well as coaching, throughout Europe and Asia, as well as a bit in North America. This was back when debating was in its offline era. I'm not sure if many of you remember that, but I actually traveled, which I very much enjoyed. And again, thank you for having me on.
No, thank you. We've still got, oh no, Lucy's just up here. All good. Okay. So for those who've just joined us, we've just had all our very accomplished panel introduce themselves. So thank you again, everyone, for being here. I'm just going to launch straight into it, and I might start in the same order, and then we can do some reverse ordering, so not everyone, so Lucy doesn't have to speak first every time. But some of you have already touched on this, so perhaps we can just delve into a bit more further detail. Like, in all honesty, how, like, do you think debating has helped you in your career, and what specifically do you think it was? Was it the skills, or the confidence, or the knowledge? What do you think has been most helpful, if it has been indeed helpful? So starting with you, Lucy, if that's okay, and then we can mix it up.
Yeah, so two different ways it helps depending on which job you're talking about. So in teaching or / coaching / management of a language school, very much so, in terms of just being able, like, from the smallest level of being able to manage a small room of 8 people to the level of, like, I think most debaters who do debating for more than a year or two have probably coached at least a session before or led some form of classroom environment. And you can obviously work on those skills the more you delve further into coaching or delve further into teaching, but at a very basic level, just a confidence and a level of control over those you are teaching massively helped me. In terms of managing and running a school, like basic interactions with your teammate, to running a CA team, to dealing with an org comm, and this might sound mean, but dealing with fuck ups as they arise, because humans are humans and make mistakes and maybe don't send the email that they're meant to send. I think for most debaters, there is a level of confidence that you can get from debating, of just, first of all, having to give a speech 15 minutes after you hear what it's talking about, to dealing with different types of people from around the world. In recruitment, I suppose, and in communications, which I think maybe a lot more debaters do want to get into, very basic things like being able to start a sentence and finish off your thought in written form or in spoken form is massively important when trying to communicate, either online or in a meeting. If you're trying to sell something to your client and you're unable to formulate a sentence properly or sound confident in the service you are trying to provide them, they're unlikely to take you seriously and choose your company to either invest in or to work with. And then finally, I suppose for me in recruitment, I don't know how many people in this call want to get into recruitment, but to know the inverse of what people are looking for as well, I suppose, for all of you. I think actually many recruiters look at a CV or look at a cover letter in the same way as most judges would nearly look at a speaker scale. It's not as formulaic as you might think. Very often it is the impression that you can give of yourself in that cover letter. So I use my debating skills when scanning through hundreds of cover letters to try and pick out the sort of things that stand out to me. And those things that end up standing out to me very often are very similar things that would be something that would lead me to the higher end of the speaker scale. So like finishing off the thought that you started, or explaining yourself with actual reasons rather than just saying you're smart. Again, I can talk later on specific skills for cover letters if that's better for later on in the conversation. But largely debating has given me a confidence, I suppose, to back myself when going into careers that I never thought were possible. Like when I was in school, communications wasn't a course you could take at university, or at least at Irish universities. It wasn't something that I ever thought was possible. And it was only through debating really that I realized that was something I was good at. I always knew I was good at talking, but I didn't realize that I could get a career out of it. And I suppose now debating kind of led me down that way, and also made me meet other people who kind of pushed me to go into communications and to go into a role like this if maybe they had it in their country and I didn't. So largely that's my 2 cents.
Awesome. Thank you very much. I think I would have not really conceptualized the way in which like judging something like would sort of, and how you conceptualize the score is like evaluating candidates. I think that's a very interesting observation. Well, Josh, obviously like presumably in debate coaching, debating would be quite relevant, but so that seems pretty self-evident, but I'm wondering if you have any I guess, particular insights on this? I mean, in the way that that's kind of translated to that line of work. And obviously, you know, I'm sure there are many other things as well that you're sort of interested to do in your life, and and how you might be kind of conceptualizing that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, of course, in specifically related to, you know, coaching and teaching, as Lucy's already touched on, you know, I think just being comfortable in front of an audience, especially if it's an audience of older students, but regardless if it's an audience of younger students, being able to have composure and have this persona that you put on that makes other people feel confident in you, which by extent makes especially kids feel comfortable with you, because if your insecurities or your concerns about, you know, being in that space are evident on the outside, they internalize that as well. And so, you know, being in a space that makes them feel comfortable, they have to feel like their teacher, their instructor, their own coach is confident, comfortable in that space as well, which I think probably a lot of us have experienced an educator at some point in our lives who maybe was a little bit insecure, and those insecurities end up being projected onto the students. And so being able to kind of manage that, because everyone has those things, you know, so it's about managing those things when you're in the classroom with other students, that you can do your best to put what they need and put their experiences in that moment first and foremost in the classroom. I think in general as well, it may sound a bit self-evident on the surface, but where I'm going with it, I think, is a little bit divergent from that, is of course being able to translate your experiences from how you learned debate, what worked for you, what didn't work for you, being adjustable in the classroom based on that, and not kind of being over reliant on perhaps many of the more traditional ways that debate has been taught, or even perhaps the way that you were taught that specifically didn't work for you. But I think more importantly, what I mean by this is that everyone has those experiences. And this was actually one of the, you know, our primary recruitment tactics at LearningLeaders, is that we didn't just look for people who had prestigious breaks at majors, because that doesn't necessarily, or often actually doesn't, make you a good coach. And the types of things that allow you to connect with students, the types of understandings, or the ability to break down something really, really complicated into something that's digestible, and being able to work that back with students, are all things that, you know, don't come from breaking first at Worlds. And I think that's something that actually a lot of debaters have, probably because of the experiences they've had with debate, probably because of the ways in which they've engaged with debate. And often we brought on lots of people who didn't even necessarily have debate experience. We brought on theater educators. We actually hired a basketball coach at one point, who was really jazzed about making the transition into debating and working with our youngest students, especially, where classroom management is just as important as being able to, you know, teach a fifth grader what a rebuttal is. And I think reflecting on the types of experiences that I'm sure everyone in this call has, or that you might know of people having, there's a lot of stuff there that can translate into being a good coach and being a good mentor, and just being able to help somebody else. And it's not what's on your debating CV. I think beyond coaching and teaching in general, I think some of the things that I've just found really helpful from debating writ large is, one, concision, you know, being time pressured. And I've actually been participating in a couple of 5-minute competitions recently, doing some programs, and the time pressure is very real at 5-minute comps. And I think all of us have probably been at a meeting where somebody was rambling on and on and on, something that could have been handled in 20 seconds or less, or perhaps even an email. So being able to be concise and, you know, preemptively say, I have 2 really quick thoughts on this, throwing that out there, being able to quickly identify what's missing in a meeting, or what everyone else seems to be operating on implicitly, but no one's actually talked about yet. It's the same way that you're looking at a top half debate and how you insert yourself. So both being able to see what's missing, and I mean, I'm using flow on purpose. I would never usually know that, but you usually use that, but flowing the debate and then being able to concisely insert yourself into a meeting, I think is something that's really helpful, and something that all of your colleagues and the people that you work with will appreciate, and you will become known for the longer that you work with them. I think the second is confidence. And I think that the type of persona that we adopt, I was mentioning it before for teaching, but I also think it's extraordinarily relevant in interviews. And I think, unfortunately, you know, and I have lots to say on this, having worked in HR, and I'm sure that Lucy does as well, is like, there's an extraordinary amount of really messed up things that a lot of interviewers do or look for, or types of things that they were taught. And I'm really passionate about the ways in which that can change, but also realistic about the fact that, you know, that change isn't going to happen overnight. And so being able to manage what it is that a lot of interviewers are looking for, and a lot of the times that's the impression that they made within the first 30 seconds of you walking in the door. And so being able to adopt that personality, that persona, that confidence, however that you relate to that right away, I think is really helpful. But I think something that also helps with that is having a broad base of knowledge. And I think that we make fun of debaters a lot for, knowing a little bit about everything and maybe not being experts in anything. But I think a lot of the time, the most technical skills that you learn at a job happens on the job. And what gets you in the door is being able to be confident in the interview, connect with your interviewer about something that's happening in their life, or something that's happening in current events, or when they ask you a question, being able to connect it to something in the world around you. And it's there that having a really broad base of knowledge is super, super helpful to be able to even get yourself into that door, and where you can get the technical training later on. I think the last thing, and honestly, this was one of the reasons why I am so passionate about debate coaching and in general, spent the time that I did at LearningLeaders, is that it literally doesn't matter what industry you're in, whether you want to be an entrepreneur or whether you want to be a librarian. Being able to make your voice heard and be confident, being able to persuade somebody else, is the only way that you're going to be able to get promotions. It's the only way that you're going to be able to pitch project proposals. It's the only way that if you see something wrong at the workplace, you'll be able to convince management who's often, as we say, perversely incentivized not to change things, to change something. And so regardless of, the way that you're walking through the world, being able to walk through on that path confidently is something that I think debate is really meaningful and helps everyone with.
Thank you. That was all very, very useful, I think. Sarah.
Yeah.
What about you?
Yeah, I have some thoughts. I'll start with like the biggest thing, I think, and then maybe like some small things at towards the end, where I think debating has helped. I think the single biggest thing that debating has helped in terms of my career is kind of teaching me to break down really unfamiliar topics that you wouldn't know like more than like a cursory knowledge of, like headline news, kind of skimming kind of knowledge of, into mechs, into like logical parts, being able to present that in some kind of manner that makes sense and that's easy for people to follow, for the layperson to follow, and consequently feeling confident in being able to present that idea. I mean, like I said before, like I have no background in economics. I didn't take it at A level. I didn't take it at O level, but I'm working in the economic ministry. That's tough, like even if my job isn't directly about economic policy, like trade is more about IR than it is about economics. It's still dealing with a lot of subject matter that I'm not used to. But actually, a lot of it is really just about mechs, like mechanisms. Like people who I've judged know that I care a lot about mechanisms. That's what we call it in debate land. But what we call it in like, civil service work is like levers, right? Like you have different levers through which you can create some kind of change, and which levers are either more plausible to use or like better suited to what you're trying to solve to get the impact that you want, or which levers are within your control versus within other people's control. That kind of analysis really matters a lot in my line of work. And in debating, like as a secondary point to this, like debating cares a lot about like the average reasonable person and being able to break down anything, regardless of whether you like know a lot about it, you've done a PhD about it, or like you've just found out about it this morning after listening to the PM speech, like anything into like something that the average reasonable person would find persuasive and would be able to follow along and track, right? And like, that's actually really true, and at least in civil service, because the people that you deal with, like number one, your bosses, might not be the ones that have the most information about things, like either because sometimes civil service, like you have this like rotational stuff, like kind of rotational staff, so a lot of times bosses are kind of rotated from other parts of the ministry. And in fact, in Singapore civil service, we don't like typically, there are some schemes where you're not allowed to stay in the same sector for 2 postings in a row. So almost always there's going to be someone that didn't have a background in this. Or even if your bosses know what you're talking about, sometimes as like what we call the staffer, like the junior staff on the team, you would end up knowing more about, you end up knowing more about like about the topic that you're researching, because you're like the policy lead on that topic. And so you have to explain it to a boss and be able to like explain in a very short amount of time, because bosses don't have that much time to kind of pay enough attention to this subject, to this project, as you have in the past 2 weeks. And thirdly, because at the end of the day, civil service is accountable to the public, and a lot of our work is also about like putting out lines and putting out speeches and explanations and publicity about our policies and how they affect the public and why they're beneficial and to the public's interest. And that's still going to be about the average reasonable person, sometimes the average unreasonable person, but ultimately something that you're trying to kind of cater to the lowest common denominator in order to appeal to. So I think those are definitely skills that are underrated in debating. I feel like, the ability to just like have someone kind of relate to you and agree with you at the end of a discussion is really important. It's not something that the average like super high qualified in like candidate that spent like 4 years studying like really, really intensively about this like one niche topic is going to be able to do, right? And so I think that that's actually one of the biggest transferable skills that I think we actually end up getting out of debating. Some corollary benefits that I think are also useful is the idea of like empathy and being able to kind of analyze the situation from different stakeholders, kind of think about a problem and how that impacts lots of different people, and then empathizing with them, right? Like lots of the times when you do extensions, or even just like another point about how this like hurts like one group disproportionately, you're empathizing with them. You're empathizing about how their lives are going to be so affected by this policy, or why this is like a huge problem that you need this policy to solve. And I think that that's something that you really, really need in a job to be able to kind of relate and make that job meaningful to you. A lot of people try to find careers and things that are meaningful to them, but I also think that it's useful, like in debating as we do, to like find the meaning in the job, like find the meaning in that topic. Like no matter what motion you get, you're always going to be able to find a stakeholder that this motion means a lot to. And I think that's a useful skill in being satisfied with your job and being happy with your job. Yeah, two more things. One is that I think that debating helps a lot in fast thinking. Like, I mean, 15 minutes perhaps is no joke. Anybody else outside of the debate circuit would be astonished by like how much you get done in 15 minutes. And that's really useful. Firstly, because, well, at least in my job, a lot of the work is like real-time affairs. Like I see something on Financial Times and I'm like, shit, I gotta go back to work, guys. I gotta go write an email about this. And so like, I think that that's really useful when you're trying to form like independent opinions while like the situation is still evolving. But I think also like in terms of work efficiency, in terms of answering questions by your bosses, in terms of getting out of like tight spots, like it's always going to be useful in your career. And the last thing I'll say is in terms of like managing a discussion, I think that actually I learned a lot more from judging than I did from speaking in the debate community. And that's because I think judging is about managing a discussion and ensuring that everyone comes out of like this 15 minutes like discussion time feeling satisfied and confident with the decision that you arrived to, learning to agree to disagree, but then still coming out with a consensus decision or something that the majority of people can get behind and back. And even where you do disagree with people, being like, I see your point, I see where you're coming from. I think that's a really fair point of view to have. Like, I would love to talk more about this if we had more time, and then diffusing the situation and still coming out with a result. I think that that's one of the most important things that I learned in debating. And it's something that really, really helps in the workplace because you don't have lots of time to kind of marinate over a problem. But at the end of the day, especially in the line that I'm in, where it's not really about hard numbers that determines whether you get promoted. It's based on like how people see you and perceive you in the office, whether you're seen as getting stuff done, and whether people come out satisfied with working with you. That kind of relationship management and kind of discussion panel management is really, really important. So that's a soft skill that I think is really useful, and I think is really underrated in the debate community, where a lot of people don't like to judge as much as they like to speak. Yeah, I think it's useful.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sarah. And now finally, Siri, do you have over to you.
All right. As the least native speaker on this call, I know better than to extend by deepening analysis, especially after many of the comprehensive points raised by everyone before me. I think there's one thing I will add, and there's another thing that's different that I will talk about. In the line of work where I come from, which is professional services, and in particular management and strategy consulting, where we really care about are people who are structured and like the intuitive breaking down of a point into sub-points or into clear categories, which are by and large mutually exclusive, is something which we drill into you when you do debating and when we coach people, but we never grasp the full importance of, myself included, until we get into a professional environment. And for me, that sort of skill set, like breaking down a problem into its constituent issues and identifying each one of them and figuring out, all right, where do I need additional pieces of proof? Similar to the way you're building an argument to substantiate a claim, was incredibly useful. And I mean, to be honest, to this day, it still is. I'm currently in business school. After I finish with this panel discussion, I'm going back to my group and I will probably hammer them on this point. Do we have enough evidence to substantiate this claim? I think more broadly though, where debating was useful for me, something I flagged previously when I spoke, is I'm not sure about the other panelists here, but going into university, I had no bloody clue what I wanted to do in life. I studied international affairs, ultimately ended up in a very, very different industry. And for me, debating was in many ways a medium through which I could still pretend to be doing something meaningful, whereas in reality, I was just satisfying my interest in a variety of different topics. And really, that's the way in which it helped me. The way in which it helped me is there is another way to extend this into your professional career, which is where you can do things like management consulting, where you really start to understand a load of issues, but you're not a full expert on anything, at least for the next couple of years, until your employer forces you to specialize in something. And I don't think my profession is privy to this. I think you'll see this in many other professions. Corporate law is probably the first one that comes to mind. What Sarah is doing, especially with the rotations you see in the Singaporean government, is another one. But really what debating helped me with was to realize there are so many interesting things out there beyond what I did in my undergrad, and that there are so many interesting people which are doing things which I find terribly boring. And I'll end on this point. Back a long time ago, more than a decade in fact, when I was enrolling in my undergrad, I found economics and business terribly, terribly boring. And ultimately decided on politics through a weird set of circumstances. That is largely the industry I ended up in. Had it not been for some amazing speakers I have met through these years who were working in those industries or disciplines or were interested in them, I would have never entered the area of business I was in. I mean, also, with all due respect to all PhDs on the call, had it not been for debating, I also would have made the terrible decision of doing a PhD and probably pushing myself into clinical depression. So I'm very thankful as well that I did not go for more academic degrees, even though I'm doing an MBA. But as some people may know, an MBA isn't really a difficult degree.
Awesome. Well, thank you everyone for sharing that about your experiences. I might stay on you and we'll sort of go back in reverse order. I'd be interested in talking about applications, so your resumes, things like cover letters. And I'm, I guess, conscious that this is probably very, I guess, different for all of you. So perhaps yourself, Siri, if you've been in the job market for a little longer, I'm curious whether you still see some of those things as personally for me, I've dropped, I guess, some of my university things off my resume the longer I've been in the workforce, for example. Josh, I'm sure you've got particular tips that are applicable in the conscious of the debate coaching market specifically, and as well for you, Sarah, in the government. And then Lucy, I guess your I guess your perspective is not so much from your own, but I guess you see resumes and cover letters every day. So I'm sort of curious to work through any thoughts or personal reflections you've got on that front. So maybe we'll start back to front this time.
All right, thanks. I mean, first of all, I've been in the job market for a while. I'm kind of back on it again, but not really. But debating is still super relevant. And there's a number of reasons why I think it's super relevant, irrespective of what industry you're in. Whether you're in the public sector, in nonprofit, in the private sector, or anywhere else. The skills you gain are incredibly transferable. I think everyone talked about the kinds of practical skills they use on the job, but in terms of how useful it is on your resume, I cannot emphasize this enough. The ability to manage time critically, the ability to prioritize, the ability to see different sides of any issues, no matter how opinionated you are on it, to work within teams. If you're convening competitions, to work on usually very low budgets, and to provide a very viable and good product to everyone. Also, if you think about convening competitions, it's incredibly specific and difficult. You have a large number of people in an auditorium who are supposed to go to a number of different locations within the 15-minute time frame. Judging, assessment of complex issues and interdependencies between 4 different groups of people. In terms of how useful it is, the way you can tailor debating is amazing. Like, you can tailor it to almost any job. And I've been using it extensively so far. I mean, as I'm now officially back on the job market for an internship, even though I'm 29 at this point, have a decent amount of 4 years of work experience, I still put work I did in debating NGO in Serbia on my CV, even though I've removed some of the internships I did back when I was a student. I cannot emphasize how useful it is. And I think the one point to make this more tangible for everyone on this call is, even if you didn't like break at a major international, there's probably a smaller competition you broke at. Even if you were never a competitive speaker, you probably were involved in organizing something. Even if you weren't involved in organizing something, you were probably a wing judge who broke at some competition and was involved in assessing these things, or you volunteered at a competition. The way you can use debating to strengthen your CV and to tailor it to give these soft parts of applications for whatever job you're going for is incredibly useful. And especially with the variety of soft skills you get through it, it can be tailored to almost anything. So it has been and will probably remain incredibly useful for at least next half a decade for me.
Awesome. Thank you very much for that. And wait, we're up to Sarah.
I really second that. I think that debating is super relevant, especially if you're part of that ecosystem that the community has built. Outside of the speaking achievements, the stuff about convening, the stuff about coaching, which I dabbled in quite a bit in my early part of my undergraduate years and before I started my undergraduate studies, like that stuff is really, really useful. And I know that some people sometimes are concerned when you put a lot of your time into debating that like it seems to pop up everywhere in your CV or in your application, like every section has something about debating. Just call it something else. Just say you convene like a large event for like an international audience of like 500 people or something. Like you know, there are ways to make it sound novel and still applicable without necessarily highlighting to the person reading that it is from your debate skills, even though it is. So like I completely agree that debating is a really, really rich activity that you can draw a lot out from. I think in addition to that, I will also say that debating has been really useful in terms of like interviewing for me. And I know that a lot of people are like, oh yeah, of course you're like a debater. Of course you can like, you know, deal with interviews very well. The stuff like Josh said about the POIs and answering those is super true. But I will touch on one specific thing, which is that I think debating has been really, really useful to me in terms of talking about my personal struggles with mental health and asking for those allowances. There are a lot of that discussion in the debating community, but also the debating community is so supportive and so open about these discussions that I found it much easier to find the words to talk to my employers, my potential employers, about my situation, what I needed, what I could still do, and as well as be a proof point to show that I can still be really competent and still be really accomplished, and you know, and get the job done, despite like my mental health situation or whatever not. So I think it actually has been really, really impactful for me in that front. And it's almost like a safe space where I could kind of practice articulating myself and kind of being very, very sure of my words and what I mean before I went for interviews. So yeah, I think those two things in terms of the CVs and like the different aspects of debating that could be useful, and the mental health. Sorry, one more thing to add as well. In terms of the different aspects about debating, like, you know, everything that Siri said was true, but also I think one particular aspect that worked very well from my line of work, and I think could be applicable to many other sectors, is the kind of international diversity of experiences. So like the kind of places you've been to for competitions, the friends that you've made, the people that you interact with on a regular basis, being able to say that, you know, like every weekend I hang out with people from like X number of countries, like across Europe, across the world. I regularly Zoom call with people all across in like multiple time zones now. Like that kind of stuff is really useful for international facing jobs, because a lot of my job is handling people through those cultural differences and still making connections really quick with them in order to get that rapport and their working relationship. So I think that's also something that I would highlight as well.
Thank you. And I definitely echo the being able to express your kind of limitations and your mental health needs at work. I definitely relate to that one. So Josh, I will sort of combine this as well with, I think I had a sort of sub question for you around broader tips for people that might want to get into debate coaching, and sort of how you've approached that with applications and resumes and all fun things.
Sure. Awesome. So I have lots to say. I will try to be concise. One, I really want to build on what Sarah said really quickly about like the network that you have, because I think that one of the things that you hear espoused so much of the time is like the importance of having networks and, you know, what are the types of back-end opportunities that get passed around. And honestly, what the average person struggles the most with in terms of accessing those opportunities is like regularly keeping up with your network. Like my dad, you know, who's been in leadership for like 30 years, has a whole spreadsheet of people that he has to reach out to like every couple of months to make sure he's maintaining that connection. And I think debate gives you like a back door into a massive global network of people who are all pretty similar to you, care about the same things as you, and often are going to be quite willing to help you with things if you reach out to them. You know, I think I can attest to every person on this call that if someone reached out to us because they were interested in working in trade, or if they're interested in entering HR or management consulting, that we would be really happy to chat with them and might even pass them along to a job opportunity at the company that we're working at. And it's the type of baseline ethos and connection that if you reached out to someone else is much harder to forge versus being like, hey, I don't know if you recall, but I bumped into you in round 3 of Cambridge. You know, that was a really fun round and I heard you did trade. I wanted to reach out to you. And I know it sounds silly, but it's a much quicker way to be able to chat with people who have direct, you know, experience and can expose you to the types of things that you're really interested in, that you're looking for. And is something that a lot of people outside of the debate community struggle with. Like, who do I reach out to? I'm so nervous. I don't have anything to talk about with them. And we have all of those things checked off and answered, which is, I think, really cool. I think the second thing is that I really want to echo what Sarah said about bringing the experiences that you have about equity and the types of things that the debate community isn't perfect about, but often does a lot better than I think what the average workplace does, or what like the average conference does. My dad, for example, was blown away when he came to his very first debate tournament last year, exactly a year ago, February. It was Empires in New York City when I was there fleeing from China when Corona just first started breaking out. And so it was the first opportunity for them to come see a debate tournament. And, you know, my dad runs HR for the entire US Navy. And one of the huge questions that they've been having are just lots of like granular issues they've been working around in terms of the inclusion of trans troops in the military is, you know, what do we do about gender recognition and gender affirmation in the workplace? And it came up in a meeting. They were like, we don't even know what all of our sailors' pronouns are. And my dad was like, well, I went to this debate tournament last week, and before every meeting, they introduced all of their pronouns to each other, and it was just a regular normative part of the framework. And all the other generals and admirals were blown away and thought it was a stellar idea. And it's something that they're considering doing, or they're considering incorporating in the types of meetings that they're doing. And so it's honestly little things like this that I think we've become hyper normalized to within debate spaces that are not at all normative outside of it, and that they can be really transformative to take that with us and not let what are some of the genuinely good things that the debate community does rest or kind of die in the debate community. Like, make sure to continue to take that with you elsewhere, because there's a lot of places where that can have meaningful impact. I would say in terms of applications, I think that debating is really, really powerful and helpful for a lot of the actual technical steps of applications. I already mentioned this in my intro, but Schwarzman interviews specifically ask you for a policy question where they give you 60 seconds to make a policy recommendation, which literally any debater can do. And they often ask about things that we debate about all the time. But lots of other applications like Schwarzman or like Knights Hennessy have, for example, group projects where you put with a group of people and you have like 15 minutes to accomplish a task, and you're being watched about how well you work with other people, how well you manage the discussion, which again, like Sarah talked about, is literally, you know, panel management, working with strangers that you might not even know, that you're working together towards a common goal. And it's kind of sort of competitive, but not really. And you're being evaluated on it, and people are literally grading each other. It's almost the exact same paradigm transferred into what a lot of these applications ask you to do. The third thing in terms of like LinkedIn and resume, which things I'm just like very nerdy and passionate about, so people can definitely feel free to reach out to me. I would definitely recommend you put debating in. I think all resumes should have an extra line at the very bottom, even if it's one page, just one line that talks about some of the things that you personally are interested in. I know debating might feel like it seems super nerdy to people outside the community, but it's those types of personal touches that allow your interviewer to connect with you when they're looking at a sea of like robotic resumes where everyone cites the exact same experiences, has worked at the exact same places. Even if you've also done that, if you have one line at the bottom that allows you to stand out a little bit, that's great. And it doesn't matter if it's nerdy, because interviewers are secretly nerdy too. I've seen management consulting resumes that had like netball in their extra section, which is arguably even more niche and nerdy than debating is. And so I wouldn't worry about that, because that's something I've heard a lot of debaters talk about. So I think that one line at the bottom of a resume can be helpful, just to mention that you've, you know, been a collegiate debater, you've been a global debater. I think especially on LinkedIn, which is where a lot of interviewers and, you know, talent seekers, and I'm sure Lucy can also attest to this, go to get more information about the candidate. If I've liked the one-page resume that you've sent to me, I will go to your LinkedIn so I can learn more about you, and I can compare some of the other experiences that I know you've left off because you didn't have space in your resume, but now I want to see them. And that's where you can platform all the amazing work that you've done within the debating community. And that's where you have the space within your LinkedIn bio, for example, to be able to give a very comprehensive link to how those skills relate to the career, whatever it is that you're working in, or the types of job opportunities, whatever they are, that you're looking for. To attest to what Stefan was saying, and also I think a question that was in the email as well, of like, what about the longer and longer you get out of college, which is something that Jess had mentioned as well. I do think the types of things you want to highlight are different, and I think it's later on that the types of experiences like convening or coaching or mentorship take on even more of an importance, you know, because 10 years down the road, interviewer is not going to care if you were a pre-semi-finalist at Amsterdam or not, but an interviewer will care if you literally run, you know, if you were on the WUDC council and have run the largest student event in the entire world, or if you were part of the largest women and gender minorities competition that's ever been run in Scotland, right? These are the types of opportunities that are, they're really meaningful in debating, but they're also really meaningful to other people in the real world, because those are the types of things that people connect with. And those are the most types of things that are transferable outside of debating, because people don't understand 14 debating, but they do understand platforming voices that are otherwise not heard. I think the last thing in terms of coaching as a career, and I'll try and be really brief here because I know I've been saying a lot, is one, try and start getting debate coaching experience right away. Just, you know, that's where you learn and where you become a better coach, trying to teach this directly. And what are multiple different ways that I can teach a fifth grader rebuttal, especially a fifth grader that's struggling with rebuttal or just genuinely doesn't have the confidence to do that. And you really only are able to develop that or learn from other coaches and like what their pedagogy is on that when you're in that space. And so even if it's volunteer spaces like DebateMate in the UK is really awesome to be able to do this and both work with students who really need the help and aren't going to get coaching anywhere else, but also it's an opportunity for you to become better at a coach. I think secondarily, like I mentioned before, even if you don't have access to the types of spaces, any type of teaching or coaching is good. Not all debate companies do, but I can certainly attest that LearningLeaders specifically hires coaches who come from really diverse backgrounds, and all of the skills are transferable at the end of the day, especially because the majority of the students that you're working with are not going to be WSDC students, you know, who are vying to become, you know, champions. The average student you're going to be working with is somebody whose parents sent them there because they're not confident enough to speak up in class, or you know, they're potentially interested in debate, but in reality, they grew up in a conservative Christian community like I did, and they have a really limited worldview, and literally just learning to think a little bit more critically. And I think it was Sarah was saying, empathize with other people allows them to maybe not only empathize with other people, but also empathize with themselves and the struggles that maybe they're going through, or that they're bottling up, or they don't have any other outlet to be able to learn about. And you as a coach can share that with them. And you know, that has nothing to do with how much debate coaching you've done, and everything to do with how comfortable you are with students and how jazzed you are to be working with them, and what you're bringing into that classroom and what you're providing with them. I would say my two specific recommendations, and people can always feel free to chat with me or reach out to me and I'd be happy to help, that if you really are really interested in doing debate coaching as like a strong professional step and not just something that you want to do, you know, after work or on the weekends, I think the two directions you should look in are, one, in China, or the debate education market in China is exploding. And I know obviously COVID is a little bit of a barrier right now, but I also have friends who were able to get visas and go to China, even amidst the last year, to go to coach debate. There's tons of opportunities there, and they're often quite well paid. And so I think it can be really meaningful if those opportunities don't exist where you are right now. The second thing that I would say is look at the US as well. There are tons of graduate programs in the US that will pay for your master's degree if you agree to coach debate for their teams. I can think of a dozen off the cuff all over the US that provide these opportunities. They usually look like you'll get a master's in speech and communications, and they'll pay for the entire degree and your housing, and sometimes even benefits on top of that, and you are coaching debate for them. And so that can be a really meaningful way to get a professional experience in coaching debate, where you're basically doing it as your full-time job during that period, but then also get someone to pay for your grad school. So those would be the kind of two directions I would suggest looking in if that's something you're interested in.
Awesome. Thank you very much for that. Very practical. And the pronoun story is a very, very cool one. Although as someone with debate and netball on my resume, I feel a little attacked, so that's okay. Lucy, I'm sure you could talk about tips for applicants for hours, but I suppose what are your kind of personal reflections and tips given the job you do?
Well, thankfully, these three people would probably get all of the jobs because they've said most of the good things. So that's very good. But I'll say a couple of specifics that I think will help regardless of what stage of your debating career you're at, whether you're like 20 or whatever age we are. Okay, so I think that in the recruitment industry, it is becoming more and more normal not to focus necessarily on the degree you got. And I think this is really important for me, but also lots of debaters I've talked to who maybe did a degree in a thing that they no longer want to work in, or they didn't get as good a degree qualification, maybe because they did too much debating and failed some exams, or personal history, or just mental health issues or whatever, right? Like there's lots of reasons why people who do debating don't always get the qualification maybe that they first of all intended to, or their qualification is now no longer as relevant to them in the new job they want to go into. And I think that the important thing to note is that if you can sell the experience that you've had in a way that is, as everyone has already said, understandable to your employer, you can do this in a very good way. So a couple of things on a CV. Most employers want to know that you have done some sort of volunteering or have some sort of interest outside of whatever your job is, right? So most people prior to online debating judged for free or because they got their flight done. You can phrase that as volunteering back into a community that you liked a lot. It's a bit dodgy if you ask other debaters, but most jobs would be like, oh, that's lovely that she gives up her weekends to go judge a thing, even though I'm just doing it for a drink, but they don't need to know that. Equally, you can flip that and say that there's people willing to pay you for your talents. So if you are receiving judge funding on a regular basis, even if it is only £20 for an entire weekend, don't tell them that bit, but do tell them that there are people willing to fund you to travel the world or travel the country to do the thing you're doing. This makes the talent that is quite niche and is quite vague seem like something that is marketable to your employer, no matter what industry you're in. Every single job application that I write at the moment says things like want event management skills, communication skills, relation management skills, even if they're probably somebody who's going to end up working on their own 9 hours out of 10 hours, right? Like, so being able to talk about all the things that these guys mentioned in your cover letter or in your CV is really important. When writing that CV, do the debater thing, do the 3 reasons, say the basic thing you did, and then 3 key achievements you got from that thing, or that you think will apply to that company. You can do this at any stage. Like I got this job by literally the job I'm in now by saying how good a judge I was. Like genuinely, I wrote a CV that talked about how much debates I listened to and how many people I talked to, and I got this job. I never thought I would, but I managed to pull it off. Ever since then, so it was already kind of touched on, but there's a lot of debaters that will be in different sectors that you can reach out to. But equally, people think that they can't enter sectors because they didn't do the right degree. Communications, most countries don't have degrees in that. Charity sectors, most countries don't have degrees in any of the things to do with charity sectors, right? So if you have a set of skills and you're currently like a 21 to 27-year-old and don't know what to do with your life, take a look at what other debaters around you are doing. Most debaters actually have quite cool jobs randomly. So think through that. In terms of the last few things, the listening skills that debaters have, well, hopefully have, are genuinely unparalleled. In an interview, if you can go in with confidence, but also actually answer the question you realize your boss is probably, your potential boss is possibly asking in the subtext of the question, you will be the more impressive candidate. That meaning that, like, we all know what it means when they say, what are your goals for 5 years from now? They don't actually want to know your goals for 5 years from now. They want to know that you're going to be part of that company and that you're interested in being part of that company, and that the vision of that company is something that you really align yourself with. You're a good debater, you should be able to lie. Even a mediocre debater should be able to lie in that way to some shape or form. Obviously, if you apply for any jobs that I'm recruiting for in the Irish market, I might see through your bullshit, but most people won't. A few other things. If you, so this is to touch on the things you can draw on, I'm cognizant of the fact that we're all quite old and have done lots of things, and therefore as a 21-year-old debater, you might not have done all the things. It was touched on, but to be specific in what you're doing in your cover letter or in your application, because a lot of these skills that we've talked about are for when you get the job, right? But in your actual application, make sure that you sell the thing you have done. You may never go to Oxford competition or university, but you probably, if you are from a smaller circuit or a circuit where English isn't the first language, say that you ran a competition where English was the first language, or that even you competed in a competition where English was the first language. Very often employers, if English is a big part of either the international element of the company, or if you are applying to work in an English speaking country and you are from another country, you do have to express that you are more than just competent with English. I think debating very much so can be the way that you do that. Like, I know people who literally learned more English through debating. But equally, it is just a good litmus test as to what type of conversations you're able to have, and what kind of I suppose level of professional English you might have. And the last thing to say is teamwork. I know debaters are very self-centered very often and like to say it, but the fact that you were able to agree in 15 minutes with one other person what you were able to do, especially at a younger age, write that on your CV, write that in your cover letter, say that on a weekly basis, I have a strategy meeting with my partner, and use business words rather than debating words to do that. But they are very similar, right? All of these things were mentioned by everybody, but I think they were mentioned in a way that you can do this in the workplace. You can put it on your cover letter. Recruiters look at cover letters. I've had CEOs tell me that their cats are the thing that give them the joy in their life in their cover letter. And they're more likely to get the interview than the CEO who just says, I have worked at a company for 15 years. So make sure that you sell yourself. Make sure that you reach out to other debaters and ask them, and don't feel ashamed. And also, I used to think that my degree was worthless because it is essentially worthless. And I thought I had to go back to university again. I took the jump to go, maybe an employer will like that I'm selling myself. And it took a couple of interviews, but eventually I got it. So have the confidence, I suppose, to put yourself forward for jobs. And you might get that interview with that cover letter. And then if you don't get the job, you have that interview experience and feedback that you can bring to the next interview and the next cover letter. But yeah, obviously, if you want really in-depth, maybe not every debater in the world send me their cover letter to review, but if there's any general questions, people can ask me at some point.
That's super helpful. And the IA, whether you're paid or not paid, kind of how you can spin it both ways is, I think, a really cool tip. Look, in the interest of this panel not going over time, I might sort of combine the last two questions, and you can kind of speak about whichever one or whatever thing kind of stands out. It was kind of just like, for those of you who are still debating, a bit of just like time management, how do you balance both? And I think the answer there is don't do what Jess does is probably like the best tip. But no, you can answer sort of if you have any reflections on that, or kind of just any general other advice that you would give to people. I might start with Josh, if that's okay. So whatever you want to, whatever's interesting to you to talk about here, I'll sort of just
kind of like final thoughts or final content. Yeah. Oh man, I packed so much of what I was excited about into my last answer. I would just say,
well, you're someone that takes on a lot, Josh, I think you're, we can't stop inventing tournaments to convene. That's maybe our problem.
I think that's true. I have a very low tournament convening threshold. I've discovered that it's clearly other people just have a higher one because they convene less. So that's fine. That's a personal issue. If there's a support group for that, I'd appreciate if someone would let me know. But otherwise, yeah, I think actually something I would want to say, because I was actually chatting about this with a group of debaters yesterday, and the framing was different yesterday, but I think the idea is the same, and it links back to what I was saying about the network earlier, is that in general, I would encourage people to just be a little bit less afraid to ask for help. The debaters I was speaking with yesterday at a pro-am comp, this was more in the lens of, reaching out to other pro debaters, especially if their circuit doesn't have any, or if, the ones that are in their circuit, don't have the bandwidth to be able to, help them, just to like ask questions or learn. And that like a lot of, speakers who are more experienced will be really happy to, pro-am with them, even if they don't know them. And all you have to do is reach out, and the worst that they can do is say no. And I think that extends both to, in general, what I totally agree with everything that Lucy was talking about, that, so much a lot of the time is literally just like taking that first step and reaching out. And sometimes you're not always qualified for the position, or sometimes you are qualified, but the reason why you don't is because you don't feel qualified, and that self-perception that's stopping you from reaching out. But I think that also I would just reiterate, just to make use of the community and the network that we have, and especially with online debating, I think that people have been able to connect with so many more people around the world and build those relationships. And even if they're not someone you necessarily went to uni with, not to be afraid to ask for help on things, whether that is tournament convening, coming in to run something that maybe the debate community has never done before, and there's probably going to be people who are really jazzed about that, and maybe really want to do it too, and nobody just had taken the first step yet. But the same also extends to all of the types of professional things and opportunities we're talking about. If you're interested in literally any type, I think, of fellowship, industry, job opportunity, job path, there's definitely a debater somewhere who's already doing that. And based on everything we've talked about on this call with all the types of transferable skills, are probably doing pretty okay at it, and would probably be really willing to help share how they got into it, what doors, were available for them, and maybe help you find one of the doors yourself. And of course, I know that, there's, for a lot of people, that's really hard. And people have different personalities about how they, connect with different people, or how willing they are to, like do cold calling and whatnot. And so, I think that, having something like debate that helps you open doors, just don't be afraid to use it, I think.
Wise words, I think. Thank you for that. Sarah, I mean, you're still a bit involved in debating as well. You keep yourself busy, but so any thoughts on that, or literally anything else, I suppose?
Just a little bit busy, just a little bit. Yeah, I think like the biggest thing I've been learning, and I'm not perfect at this, is learning how to say no, but also when to say no. There are a lot of times when I've had to turn people down. I see some of you on the call, I'm sorry, but you have to be kind to yourself, and you have to be reasonable about what you can do. And I think that's an important skill at work when you're kind of talking about your bandwidth and how much you can take on. And it's important in debating as well. So I take more of a work professional view on debating. But I think secondly, it's also knowing when to say no. Like, you can't have your entire life be about work. You have to do something fun and something that is fulfilling for you. Debating is somewhat fulfilling for me, and that's picking when it is more fulfilling and making the time for it, but also then figuring out which of these opportunities might be less fulfilling, and then shelving them for another time, another year, another edition of the tournament. I think that's really important. And I think being able to talk to your boss about it. So like I lucked out. I told Jess I'll share this story. I lucked out. My boss is a debater. It's really weird because we have a lot of mutual friends. It's really weird. And she knows exactly what happens at break night parties, which is not a good thing for your boss to know. But it was really easy for me to go to my boss and be like, hey, I'm applying for like EUDC, DCA. Is that okay? I'll just need like 2 weeks off in August. And it's useful because she knows what it's like, and she checks in on me, and she's just like, are you sure you're okay? Like, I can be like, I have a tournament this weekend, and she'll be like, okay, off you go. I try not to disturb you this weekend. So that's convenient for me. But if you have a boss that isn't as familiar with the debating community, learning how to put that across and be like, I've got this really cool like opportunity to do something for a community that I was very involved in university. It's like an alumni thing, or it's like a volunteering thing, like all the other tips that Lucy was talking about, all the ways to frame it, like figure out a way that works for you and works for the boss that you're trying to communicate to, and figure out a way to like have that be recognized as something that's part of your workload at work. Because I think a lot of companies care about what you do outside of work. Like, lots of companies have like funds or like programs to like give you time off or give you money to like fund your extracurriculars. I know one of my friends just bought like a few $100s worth of books off like company funds for like personal development. Find out whatever your company does for that, and tap on it and say that debating is very good for personal development, because it is, so there is a way to have your cake and eat it too. But mostly I would say try not to DCA a major while you're working. It really kills you. Don't do it.
Feels. Indeed. Thank you for that. Siri, what about you? Do you have any reflections? You're not debating much these days, but or you've been roped into CA something I've seen recently.
Correct. And I can explain that as well. So I think my two general tips are: find what you enjoy about debating, and try to do as much as you're comfortable with on that. And that's where I'll explain the CA in a bit. The other thing I would say is reflecting a bit on the debating, which I did, but also, I mean, in retrospect, I turned out right for entirely accidental reasons, is be cognizant of where people you like are going towards. It might be very good information. So let me explain both of those briefly. In terms of find what you like, I really enjoy speaking. I have been and have remained a very, very competitive. And I really enjoy the competitive thrill of a competition, like whether you make the break or not, trash talking cases of other teams. I still do it occasionally. The reason I haven't been seen recently is because I enjoy the social dimension of debating. So the value of it simply reduced too much for me when COVID started. I haven't been involved in many international tournaments other than the Dox Bridges, where I wanted to make a point about how I support for-profit enterprises. But jokes aside, what I really enjoyed was that, and with a career which I do, and I think it applies for many management consultancies. One really cool thing which we do is something that's called a leveraged flyout, or in more simple terms, if you fly to a client site over the week, you can go anywhere you want over the weekend, as long as it's not more expensive than a return ticket home. What this in practice means is that in summer, rather than returning back home to Belgrade, what I would do is go to other cool competitions in Europe, which would, guess what, be usually on the seaside, and have amazing times, like have 3 weekends off where like I do speaking, I see people whom I enjoy, but also I'm on the seaside. I think, yeah, so, and I mean, obviously consulting is a bit specific in that respect, but as people before me said, there are ways to combine that with whatever you do, whether that's a boss who's an ex-debater, whether that's a career that's conducive towards debating, whether that's an organization that cares about what you do in your free time. There are ways to try and combine this. I also did that in a previous job where I didn't get travel funding. The other thing I would say is, in terms of like where people whom you liked in debating are going towards, be cognizant of that, because it tells you a lot about the cultures of the organizations and careers whom you may end up working with. And I think you seriously should not underestimate that. For me, I wanted to do like one of these dark trader careers where you sell out to corporate giants, essentially. Ultimately, we can argue whether I did that or not. I could have sold out better potentially. But as an aside, one of the reasons why I didn't decide to become a banker was because I met some debaters who were bankers, and I simply did not like the culture. One of the reasons why I didn't become an academic is because I met some debaters who were academics and they were too depressing. One of the reasons why I decided to do consulting was because like these were just curious random people. And by and large, people whom I work with also have a similar mindset, and that's why I enjoy the job which I do to this day. And if there are people, like when you go to competitions, you'll interact with a variety of people. If there's a pattern in those whom you like in terms of what they want to do in life, it might be something that's useful to explore, because it could also be telling you something about what you yourself like. So I think the final thing I will close with on that is, it's better than the degree which you did, because debating just attracts a much bigger variety of individuals. If you're in whatever, social sciences, natural sciences, by definition, like the circle of people have a lower variance because they already were predisposed to be interested towards this. Whereas debating has this unique trait that, despite being extremely nerdy and that being universal, beyond that, like people come from a variety of backgrounds which I cannot even describe. And I think implicitly it was covered by everyone on this call. And really leverage that. It can make you think about things which you never thought of before. Reason why I ended up in the career in which I ended up on is because I met a really cool speaker from Harvard back in 2014, I believe, who was curious in the career in management consulting. So I went back home, Googled it, and I'm like, this seems really interesting. And I'm sure I'm not the only person who has a story like that.
Awesome, thanks for that. And finally, Lucy, any reflections or tips for time management? Lucy's always telling me I need to get more sleep, so.
Yeah, Jess needs to sleep more, and so do the majority of debaters. But anyway, that's another issue. I think a lot of what Siri just said is very true. Reflecting not only on what you want going forward, but what you have maybe done or gotten from debating. I think it's very easy for debaters to be self-deprecating over this nerdy, weird thing we do, and that normal people don't want it. Like, my boss weirdly thinks it's really cool and calls me like a pro debater to everyone she introduces me to, and it's quite embarrassing, but for some reason she thinks it's cool. So you never know really where you're gonna find, like, she's not Sarah's boss, but she just thinks it's cool, so she lets me have early Fridays back when I used to catch planes. You never know. You don't know until you ask. But on the reflection thing, I think reflecting on what it is that debating has given you or what you want it to continue to give you is really important. So if you manage a weird meme group for debating, that actually can be a massive skill if there's like 5,000 members instead of, like, some of you don't realize what you're doing, and that in the real world people should be paying you for these things, or that some charities would really love you to volunteer those skills to help the actual people and not privileged debaters. So there are lots of, that's my little charity spiel. Please help charities. Charities are good too. You don't have to go to McKinsey. You can also go to charities. And also charities pay more money than debaters seem to think they do. People ask me like, oh, do you earn like less than minimum wage in your job because you work with charities? No, it's quite competitive. Yes, you may never work millions and millions for a charity, but you can get a very, very nice salary working for a charity if that's something you want to do. But in terms of what you want debating to give you going forward, in the same with your career, men will apply for more things and back themselves for more things than women ever will. I have had people still in their undergraduates who are 18 to 20-year-old men applying to be a CEO of a charity because they felt they might be a good fit for the job. But I have had women saying, oh, I didn't have that one thing you asked me for, therefore I won't even apply. And this also translates to different language skills, different class backgrounds, different educational backgrounds. Put yourself forward if you think you deserve it. And if you want to deserve something in the future and don't think you're there now, work on those things that you think you need to work on now. In university, you'll be baffled when you become old and have to get up every day and do the same thing every day. Now is the time that you can work on those skills and improve those skills and volunteer for somewhere, or find someone who's willing to pay you a very small amount to do the thing, but get you the skills and the experience so that you get the future job that you want to get. And to the people who have already asked me in private chats on Zooms to read their cover letter, I'm really sorry that I mentioned this. Please don't everybody send me their cover letters. But everybody else, happy to, no, I'm not happy to see all your cover letters. I'm not. Okay, thank you for having me.
Yeah, no, fair enough. Thank you, Lucy. Thanks, everyone. So that's sort of the, I guess, official part of this discussion. So I really appreciate everyone's time. So for those of though on the panel who can hang back for 5 more minutes, please do. But just if in case anyone has any questions, either for any specific one of our panel or just more generally, otherwise do feel free if you've got commitments, that's perfectly fine. You've given up quite a bit of your time already. But yeah, does anyone here have any questions? Just feel free to unmute, or you could send it in the chat. Just give it like a POI, just don't be shy.
My personal chat's getting lots of messages. I know the rest of you.
I bet. I bet. It's like feedback. You might take 2 weeks to get back to.
It's like no one will ask direct questions, but you'll get terrible feedback on the forum.
Yeah. Does anyone have any questions for these guys before we wrap up?
I will say that working while trying to debate means that you definitely will only get to feedback in 2 weeks. Yeah. Like, if you don't catch me on Sunday night before I start work, like, I'm sorry. Like, I feel really bad, but yeah, no.
There's a question for you in the chat. Why do you hate bankers?
I don't hate bankers. It's just culture, which I find, first of all, I enjoy some sleep, at least, unlike most bankers. Secondly, and this might be a bit weird coming from me, and like people, especially for people who know me, it's a bit more of like a frat boy culture, which I don't enjoy that much. I enjoy the nerdiness a lot more, and the intellectual curiosity I didn't see that much. It's all about chasing the alphas in many cases.
Fair enough. All right. Any don't be shy if anyone has any others. Otherwise, we can wrap this one up.
To the people asking me to look at their cover letters, do you have a specific question about your cover letter? Because you could also ask that now instead
By
of
the way, Lucy, I'm applying for internships. You want to look at mine?
yours is great, I'm sure. Yeah. I actually, yeah, like I don't mind, but if you're in this, if you can prove to me that you're in this physical Zoom call, I'll look at your cover letter. Anybody watching on YouTube, that's my deal.
Anyone, anything?
Actually, I do have a question. Sorry.
Go for it. Go
No,
for it.
I was actually just asking, I mean, to what extent is it important to send cover letters? Because, I mean, usually they just skip everything and then just open your resume page. So, like, what exactly?
So a cover letter won't get you the job, but what happens is you will look at a CV, and then you'll have maybe 20 CVs that are in the maybe pile, and then you'll look at the cover letter. And if someone doesn't have a decent cover letter, unless their CV is literally like, I was CEO of everything, you're probably not. Like, it's the thing that can massively boost your CV. And when there's a breaking point between people, it's like when there's a one speak split in a debate and you need that thing to push you over the edge. That's what it is, really. It's your ability to sell yourself beyond what you have done. It's what you can do and who you are as a person as well. Pretty much, yes.
I always found the trickiest thing knowing what to like emphasize in my cover letter versus my resume. So usually I try to just like differentiate them as much as I can, because yeah, but that's something I always found quite tricky, to be honest.
The cover letter as well is probably where you talk about the values of the company and why you fit into that. And that can literally be like from a charity saying, I literally want to help the people that you help, or it can be from a private organization saying, I really like that, whatever, I don't know private lingo as well, but I really like the culture of your company and what you stand for, or the profit margins, or whatever, the competitiveness, or whatever.
I think it can, I totally agree with Lucy. And I just want to reiterate that even more, because I think that like, it honestly, once you've gotten to the final grouping of, you know, resumes or people that you're considering, the cover letter can honestly make the huge, like the entire difference in whom we end up selecting. Like, I can attest, you know, like from screening literally hundreds of resumes for, you know, both full-time and fellowship positions at LearningLeaders, and probably some of y'all's, if I've screened your resume before, I'm so sorry. But in general, like, you know, if we get to, and the same applies for any position, like you have 5 really amazing candidates, all of whom are qualified for it, all of whom who bring really interesting things, all of whom who meet the threshold of having worked in the industry, whatever. And then you go to the cover letters, and 2 of them don't even have a cover letter. 2 of them have an obvious like copy and paste cover letter that they obviously use to send to 10 other jobs. And then only 1 person has this like personalized, beautiful cover letter that demonstrates that they actually looked through, you know, the company website, and they really know what it is that your company does or cares about or does differently. You know, it makes a huge difference if you can say like, I looked at every consulting firm in Beijing, and you are the only firm that like has achieved gender parity. You know, like that's the type of values that I'm looking for in a workplace, and that is why you guys are by far my top choice, and I haven't applied anywhere else, right? And so those little things that I think are genuinely quite meaningful for interviewers, but simultaneously are also superficially really good for someone like when the CEO comes along and wants to review like the final stage of candidates, and the CEO really cares about if you looked at the website or not. You know, the CEO really cares about if you know like the personalized details of the company, because it's literally their baby. You know, like they've built it, they've probably invested years and years, if not decades, into it. And so being able to say like, yes, I did my research, and like you can write about that in the cover letter, that's where you can demonstrate that, because you can't put that in the resume, and especially if it can help you get the interview too.